The Souls games have created one of the greatest title shifts in gaming culture over the past decade. There's simply no other games like them out there, except for all the games that have tried to be Dark Souls ever since. And wait, why is Vordt still playing? Oh god, there's so many!
Dark Unreal is a third-person slasher action game set in a dark fantasy world built by one man with a plan, development studio Demix. Wow, looks like I can kill war at level 1. Sweet.
While the game supports keyboard and mouse, complete with the ability to rebind keys, it's like Dark Souls in that you'll definitely want to play with a gamepad.
Abandon all hope, ye who enter mail boldly.
Crash 4 may very well be Dark Bandicoot of Crash Souls games.
Pro Skater came out 22 years ago. What do you mean? The Souls series has had a very unique lifespan. Not only has it exploded in popularity over the past decade, but it's done so during the dawn of internet culture. This has led to the creation of a very widespread, passionate fanbase, an unstoppable meme machine, and even the naming of a new genre, Souls-like. They've also become popular during the rise of independent game development, as the internet made development tools much more accessible to more people. This strange convergence of factors has led a part of the genre to experience something that very few other genres have, a transition from 3D to 2D. This has happened for a couple reasons. 2D games are generally easier to develop than 3D, which makes the format more accessible and easier to refine for independent developers, but this is also because 2D games are developmentally more restrictive than 3D. This loss of a dimension means that developers need to be clever and innovative with their simpler toolkit in order to create complex and engaging systems. I could honestly go on all day about this, but Fudge has already done that, so to give a brief summary of his video, there's a distinct difference between originality and innovation in design. Originality can be very appealing and interesting on the surface, but it's also very simplistic on its own. It's really not that hard to create something that no one's done before, and if that's the only thing holding up your art, it's probably going to turn out a bit crap. Have you ever played Void Space Racing? That's a very original game. It's a racing game with absolutely no gravity or friction. There's literally no other game like it out there, and boy do I never want to play it again. Innovation, meanwhile, requires a much deeper, more complex interplay of elements in a work of art in order to make an interesting, holistic experience. In games, it's not simply slapping in mechanics and ideas you think are cool, it's integrating concepts into a game such that the game as a whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. The Souls games have done a lot of innovative things, I think that goes without saying, but that doesn't mean there aren't ways their mechanics can be improved, or at least used in different ways. What's great about 2D Souls-likes is that by design, they're able to focus and refine many mechanics associated with the Souls-like genre even better than the main Souls games. That's a pretty bold claim, but I think I have the examples to back it up. I want to look at 3 games that I think really cover the basis of what 2D Souls-likes are capable of. They cover most of the subgenres that have cropped up over the years and feature what I think are some incredible innovations. That said, I mostly want to analyze these games on their own merits, not just as exemplars of the genre. These games are great not because of their similarity to the Souls games, but because they're clearly influenced by Souls mechanics and ideas, and use those ideas to create completely innovative experiences. Now, this is where I admit I'm a bit conflicted about the concept of this video. I acknowledge all these games are considered Souls-likes, it's part of why I'm talking about them, but I also think the things that make these games innovative come from how they use genre conventions to become something entirely unique. Souls-like can be a useful descriptor, but it can often lead to homogenization of otherwise unrelated games based on their relationship to one popular game series. It can discourage us from seeing how games adapt familiar ideas to create something entirely innovative, which is what I really want to focus on here. Because as much as I love the culture that has spawned from the Souls games, there's a particular problem with it that I want to talk about. Something that I'm going to call Part 1, the Soulsborne Eki Ring Problem. Part of why Dark Souls had such a watershed effect on gaming was because so many elements of the game's design defied AAA trends at the time, while simultaneously scratching an itch that so many players didn't realize they had. And before the commenters get mad at me, yes, I know Demon Souls exists, but I'm talking about the Dark Souls games here because I'm referring to the series' influence on gaming as a whole. Demon Souls is an excellent game, like seriously, if you haven't played it, go do it. But when it comes to overall influence, Dark Souls is the most appropriate game to discuss. The original Dark Souls gave players a methodical, punishing, satisfying combat system, a dreary, resonant world with level design that guided players towards mastery without holding their hand. A complex, detailed narrative that, while obtuse in many ways, inspired a sense of wonder and intrigue in many players. We'll talk about these in more detail later, but the point here is that until then, no other game had gotten so much attention for doing so many of these things so well. In this way, Dark Souls is, for better or worse, very original. While it's fascinating that one game managed to do so much, there was still a lot of room for refinement. However, when a game series develops such a large, passionate fanbase this quickly, a lot of those fans can be very resistant to change. A lot of fans really like everything that Dark Souls 1 did, and expected sequels to the game would recapture the magic of their first Dark Souls experience. This is a bit ironic because judging from interviews with Miyazaki and their release history, FromSoft seems to largely prefer applying their design philosophy to new concepts and IPs as opposed to making direct, samey sequels. For all of its flaws, DS2 was a pretty ambitious project. FromSoft wanted to significantly change the series' approach to gameplay, world and boss design, and storytelling, and many of these differences innovated on mechanics and narrative elements that had only been introduced in DS1. But someone made a compilation of some bad hitboxes, so actually it's the worst game in the series, Mahler out of 10. So to make fans happy, they made DS3, which basically did all the same things as DS1 at 4 times speed.
Oh, cause it's Dark Souls 3. They put 3 at every game.
This desire to recapture the nostalgia of DS1 has even extended to other FromSoft games. This might seem reasonable because on the surface, all their games after Dark Souls are very similar. They're third-person action-adventure games with all the fixins and flavors that FromSoft is known for. However, the finer details reveal that the Souls games, Bloodborne and Sekiro, are wildly different from one another. But of course, that doesn't stop fans from trying to smash them all together into one messy conglomerate. Like, if you actually dig deep into the design of these games, the whole Soulsborne concept is kind of absurd. It's like saying that Wargroove is an Advance Emblem game, or that Wolfenstein and Daikatana are part of the expanded Doomiverse. Hey, remember how there was a whole decade of so-called Doom clones before gamers got over themselves and started calling them first-person shooters? I'm sure that has nothing to do with this discussion, forget I said anything. All of FromSoft's games are good, but this homogenization has largely limited what their games can do. While FromSoft seems to enjoy the freedom to make the games they want to make, their properties are still owned by publishers who want games they know will sell. They know that a lot of fans idealize their first Souls experience, and they know people will buy games that promise something similar. It's a condition of their creative freedom. FromSoft wouldn't be able to make something both innovative and radically different from the Souls games even if they wanted to, and it doesn't seem like they do. They seem pretty content using the third-person action-adventure template to toy around with their new ideas. But it's also pretty clear that they created Bloodborne and Sekiro because they wanted to make something that wasn't Dark Souls, which is more than can be said for a lot of Souls-like developers because there's so many!
All of that in this super action game, and prepare to die?
Part of what makes 2D Souls-like so good is that they can be miles beyond this nostalgia-fueled echo chamber. For one, being in 2D means very few Souls mechanics translate directly. Anyone who seeks to apply Souls mechanics to their 2D game must first have a solid vision and design ethos for that game. For example, Hyper Light Drifter has combat mechanics that you might say feel Souls-like, but they're integrated into a combat system with a wide variety of ranged options and where dashing isn't as reliable for evading damage as you might think. It also has a much stricter focus on visual storytelling, which makes the game do very much its own thing. Hollow Knight is probably the most Souls-like of all the games here, but even then, the elements it borrows from Dark Souls fulfill a very different purpose. This game's equivalent of bonfires are literal benchmarks, safe havens for the player, but they're also crucial for mapping out Hallownest and formatting your badge loadout, because the map and badge system are unique and crucial to Hollow Knight. Are you starting to see how the whole Souls-like concept is a little silly? These games are great because of how they reincorporate Souls-like elements, not because they're vaguely similar to a game where you hit stuff with sticks. Though you do hit stuff with sticks. It's a lot more complicated than that though. You can hit someone with an oak, a maple, a pine cone, bonsai tree. Part 2, hitting stuff with sticks. If one thing defines most people's perception of the Souls games, it's probably their combat. Their methodical, punishing, and satisfying nature is now infamous, due in no small part to a frankly disingenuous ad campaign and some particularly unhelpful parts of the fanbase. Like, these games are not designed to make you prepare to die or make you feel like a gamer god. They just have very dire consequences for your failure, which makes learning the game's systems more critical and satisfying. Souls combat also has a wide variety of options for how you build a character, with unique mechanics for how you want to approach combat. You can be a tanky beast who eats damage for breakfast, a dodgy boy who hits hard but needs to avoid damage at all costs. You can be a parry god, or pew pew all the scary monsters away with magic. In concept, this is really fun. However, it's clear that some of these mechanics were given a lot more attention than others. Take parrying for example. It's really fun and satisfying and requires a lot of skill to pull off consistently. However, it's also very situational. Only some regular enemies can be parried and even fewer bosses can. It's a cool skill to learn, but most players don't bother with it because it's just not consistently useful. Even when some bosses are parryable, you may have to look it up on a wiki first. Wow, these games have such a wide variety of viable builds. While parrying is really fun, you really have to go out of your way to learn it, and it has very limited applications. Why spend time learning precise parry windows for a few select enemies when dodging and blocking can be used for everything? This is where Lucah Born of a Dream does something really interesting. In Lucah, the dash button doubles as both your dash and your parry. If you dash into an enemy right before their attack, you stun them for quite a while and make them take extra damage. It might sound kind of silly to simplify a parry mechanic like this, but by simplifying it, the game makes parrying both accessible and complex. In Lucah, all enemies can be parried, and all combat encounters are in small rooms with multiple enemies, which means aggression and mobility are crucial. Tying parrying to a movement mechanic means that parrying can be used in a variety of ways. You can use it to focus on one enemy and do massive damage, or you can immobilize an enemy to take the heat off for a few seconds, making it an effective method of crowd control. Even in Bloodborne and Sekiro, which are built much more around parrying than the Souls games, it's a very one-on-one deal. If you parry someone, the only real benefit is to follow it up with a riposte, which can easily make you overwhelmed if you're in a crowd. By simplifying the parry, Lucah manages to make it a very dynamic component that ties together the game's fast-paced, aggressive combat. But maybe parrying isn't your thing. Maybe you want to try ranged battle? Magic in the Souls games can be really fun, especially if you want to alleviate the difficulty of some of the game's tougher moments. That said, it feels a bit tacked on. A lot of spells have high stat requirements and have a very limited number of uses, so any magic build will still end up relying on melee combat most of the time. This is probably why a lot of players really like Pyromancy.
Flameo, Hotman!
Because those spells don't require magic stats at all, but it still doesn't feel like the game was built around it. The core problem here is that ranged options aren't really integrated into the game's mostly melee system. If players have a magic build, they'll usually end up using melee most of the time, spamming hard enemies with their spells, and going back to melee again. Melee and ranged options end up being two different combat styles that need to be used separately, which is fine, it's okay. But all these games do it way better. All three of these 2D Souls-likes include built-in ranged options, and restore your ammo with each physical hit you deal. This means that your range attack is an asset you can always use, but that needs to be used alongside melee combat. It's such a simple system, but allows the player to strike a delicate balance between opening and closing distance, effectively creating a combat system that's greater than the sum of its parts. Lucah and Hyperlight also include ranged options that are distinctly different from one another, instead of just bigger spells that do bigger damage with bigger stats. Lucah's mantra system gives your familiars different speeds, ranges, and effects, and in Hyperlight, you can use different kinds of guns, a boomerang sword, or if you really want to double down on melee, a shotgun that deals massive damage up close. Hollow Knight's options are more limited, but in that game your ammo is also your source of healing. This means players need to seriously consider on the fly whether they should go for more damage or more longevity. Greater skill at the game means you can work more spells into an aggressive combat style that works well for this game. On top of that, many of the bosses offer very narrow windows to heal, so you might as well use your magic for spells most of the time. As a result, using spells is a very purposeful decision that makes the combat incredibly engaging. In general, combat in these games is very tight and refined, in part because they're in 2D. By adapting Souls-like mechanics to this more restrictive format, they're able to refine and iterate on these concepts in really dynamic ways. I remember the first time I played Lucah Born of a Dream and being worried that the combat would feel really slippery and awkward because the game's art style is so... this. I had no idea I'd be experiencing one of the most tightly designed, heart-stopping action games I'd ever played. Like, no game that looks like this should be able to play this well. It's illegal, it's a borderline felony, but somehow, Me Less Than 3 did it. It just shows, when developers need to be creative with the tools they have, how well designed a game world can be. If you've been on YouTube anytime during the past 5 years, I don't think I need to sing the praises of Dark Souls' world design, because everyone's already done it for me. So I want to focus on two things that I think Dark Souls does well, but that could see a lot of improvements: level design and art direction. I could talk about narrative storytelling here as well, but I'm giving that its own section later. The interconnected design of Dark Souls 1 is really interesting. Since the world is constructed to have multiple areas lead into one another, the player is motivated to seek out shortcuts and create their own tangible sense of the world. This game doesn't have a map system because it doesn't need one. The layout of the world is just that intuitive. However, are you noticing a pattern here? This interconnectedness also compromises the design of individual levels in many ways. I don't want to talk about why Blighttown's a nightmare, because H-Bomber Guy has already done that, but there are also areas like the Valley of Drakes, Lower Undead Burg, and Crystal Caves that end up being little more than hallways to get you to different destinations. There are also many levels that are just clearly bloated and unfinished. The Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith are an absolute chore to get through, topped with all the worst bosses in the game. Tomb of the Giants is a disorienting mess that deters any attempt at spatial awareness in a game where visual feedback is critical. I've committed a route through this area to memory, not because the level is engaging, but because I want to avoid engaging with this level as much as possible, which probably isn't a good sign. DS2 tried to do something different, designing levels that felt like refractions of DS1. Vaguely similar to the first game, but distant enough that you could tell the game was in a different time and place. It's a part of the cyclical narrative the game is telling, to make the world feel even more hopeless and inescapable. DS3 tried to do the same thing, where, well, they brought Orlando back, and that's a thing I recognize. 10 out of 10. Hey, they brought the archers back, and there's even more of them! And it's actually way more boring now, because you can just run right past all of them. You know, I'm really glad this game brought the series back to its roots. Level design is probably the most original thing about the Souls games. It's very impressive, but it also means there's a lot of room for improvement. If you're really into interconnected worlds, Hollow Knight delivers on that concept in spades. After the first couple areas, the game cracks open and you can go just about anywhere you want, though you're gently pushed toward the City of Tears. However, the game still has plenty of tricks up its sleeve to catch you in a corner. There's this breakable floor that can trap you in Deep Nest. You'll likely be excited when you find this bench, but then you realize that if you sit there, you won't be able to die and return from where you came. This bench is a commitment to find a way out of Deep Nest, and continuing to explore through 1, 2, or maybe even 5 areas you've likely never been to before. This is the kind of level design that makes Hollow Knight so great, because it actually makes you feel like an explorer in this strange, dying, hostile world. On top of that, the game has a complex map system. The game is, frankly, so large and sprawling that without a map, it would be incredibly inconvenient to navigate. But instead of simply giving you a map for each area, the game turns mapping into a motivation for exploration. In order to get a map for any area, you need to find Cornifer, but even then, his map is only an incomplete sketch. This means that for every area, the player has 2 distinct objectives: find Cornifer, and then complete the entire map on their own 2 bug feet. This makes for excellent exploration, especially in areas where Cornifer is really deep into the level or hard to find. The player is taught that this world is navigated best by using their own wits and observation skills, but that once they've developed these skills, they can use a map for when they really need it. If you don't care too much for interconnected design, these other games do something entirely different. Hyper Light Drifter isn't interconnected, but you can choose which of these 3 paths you take first. Each one is a very different kind of challenge and offers different rewards. For example, the eastern area can be really challenging if you don't have the upgrade that lets you play bullet tennis, but completing it gives you the best gun in the game. The western area is very combat heavy, but it also has a lot of upgrade materials to give you a head start, and also has the best boss fight in the game. The northern area is generally considered the easiest. A lot of it isn't accessible for now, but clearing it gives you a gun that unlocks secrets in the other levels. This means that no matter what path you take, the whole game will be challenging, but it'll be challenging in different ways, which is really interesting. And because all the game's upgrades expand your toolkit instead of simply making you stronger, the challenge of all areas is never compromised. But level design can only go so far without good art direction to really blend design and narrative together. On the surface, there's not much special about the Souls game's visual style. They're very dark fantasy, so buttresses, much wow. It elevates itself a lot by using specific details to hint at the story's lore in a very vague sense. The games try to tell its narrative without throwing it in your face, which is commendable, but they also do it in a way that lacks impact. There's not much of a hook to really pull the player into its narrative. We'll get more into that later, but my point here is that the game's art design suggests an oppressive tone, but doesn't deliver on its own. You really have to go out of your way to dig into the game's deeper tonal resonances, or just watch a lore video on YouTube. All the games I'm talking about here are stylized to express their respective tones and narratives. Hollow Knight's insectoid design makes characters and events feel more alien and unpredictable. Hyper Light Drifter has the best pixel art in any game, don't at me, and uses that to communicate without any dialogue. You are a drifter in a foreign land. This visual style emphasizes how the greater complexities of this world are lost on you, and imparts a visceral, helpless, enduring tone. These world designs aren't just oppressive and bleak, they're captivating, because they focus on making the world feel unavoidably attuned to the specific tone and themes each game is going for. Meanwhile,
everything on
Lucah
was wild.
Really? Everything?
Everything in this game is corrupted and unstable, including yourself. This visual style conveys that unflinchingly, along with blending Christian aesthetics of the angelic and demonic. This game's themes and tone, which we'll get more into later, are both sublime and specific, and I can't think of any way to make this art design convey that better. Each of these games range in scope, but all of them design their worlds in a very oppressive design ethos. They're all very open to interpretation, but they also have concrete narratives to guide them. They're designed to be stared into and engulf. They accomplish what truly amazing storytelling can do. When Dark Souls first came out, there simply weren't any other games that told their narratives quite like it did. The setting feels so bleak and empty, making you feel like there's so much more to this world than you can ever know. The game's punishing combat emphasizes the feeling that you're in a place you don't belong. Item descriptions can give some insight into the history of Lordran, but nothing gives you a truly concrete answer to what happened here, or what the future holds. The further you dig into the game, the more complex everything gets, until you finally have to make a decision that will determine the future of this world. This is pretty impressive at first glance, but I want to ask, is this the best way to tell a story like this? There are a lot of great, subtle elements of Dark Souls' storytelling, and if the entire game was like that, it would be incredible. The problem is that one cold, dreary night, Miyazaki broke into his own office, stole the game's script, ripped it up into 847 pieces, and scattered them throughout the world in different people's wardrobes. At a certain point, engaging with Dark Souls' story requires you to disengage from the core gameplay so you can go read some text boxes that may or may not have something to do with each other. This is the difference between subtle and hidden storytelling. Subtle storytelling can be ambiguous, but it also pulls the player in and gives you just enough information to come to your own conclusions. Hidden storytelling is the reason you're subscribed to VaatiVidya. Subtle storytelling is open to interpretation, while hidden storytelling just requires a lot of legwork and compilation. This hurts Dark Souls' narrative for two reasons. For one, it creates a story that's interesting to read about, but that has very minimal impact on the actual experience of playing the game. And two, even if Dark Souls' story is complex, and some questions will go unanswered, the reliance on item descriptions and lore gives the impression that all the player's questions can be answered if they just read deep enough into it, which kinda neuters the overbearing and unknowable theming that the game is going for. Dark Souls 2 has the most interesting narrative in the series, and it makes a stronger effort to integrate its storytelling into the gameplay. The realm of Drangleic is one of many kingdoms to rise and fall over thousands of years, and you can tell that after the first flame has been rekindled again and again for so long, the world itself is collapsing. Characters are losing their minds to the undead curse, forgetting who they are, while you, the player, can see that their condition is part of a cycle that keeps getting worse. The nonsensical placement of strangely familiar locations shows that the cycle is falling apart. One of the core themes of this game is that whether you choose to kindle the first flame or not is ultimately a meaningless choice, because the world is so deep in its own repetition that it needs something radically different to change its course. This also happens to be the Souls game with the fastest level up system, and the ability to reallocate stats, allowing players to freely choose what kind of playstyles they want at any time. Agency in Dark Souls 2 is a cruel joke, because it gives the player so many options for their play, and ultimately tears it all away to reveal that their choices are meaningless. A lot of people really dislike DS2 for these reasons, but it's okay to be wrong. Am I reading too deep into Dark Souls 2's weird mechanics to justify my confirmation bias? Maybe, but at least that's more interesting than trying to make Dark Souls 1 again, but faster!
They put 3 at every.
What I think makes these other games really exceptional is that they craft narratives that are simultaneously overbearing and unknowable, and do so by engaging the player through their core mechanics. In fact, Hyper Light Drifter accomplishes all of this in its opening cutscene. Pretty much everything great about this game's storytelling is all here in the opening. It shows our character traveling to a distant land in search of some sort of treatment for an illness that is making them weaker and will eventually consume them. The desolate land and long-dead titans of this world suggest that our character's journey is already doomed, but they continue anyway because it's the best thing they can do. The gameplay contributes a lot to this too. Since the game stays consistently difficult and throws enough unique challenges your way to never let you feel too comfortable, it puts the player in a position of constantly enduring struggle. This might sound like I'm spoiling the game, but I'm really not. This is the tone it sets from the beginning, and it develops a lot as it goes on. In turn, Hyper Light Drifter tells a story that is both depressing and empowering, one that is subtle and unforgettable. Anyway, Lucah Born of a Dream is about as subtle as a crucifix made out of bricks. The story of Lucah is told largely through narrative and dialogue, but it's never told directly. The writing is very slant and esoteric. It gives the player the impression that they're stuck somewhere they really don't belong, and that they have no choice but to fight their way out. This might make the story seem obtuse to some, but there's a lot that can be gathered from this. Our character, who's strongly suggested to be non-binary, comes from a church that wants all of its children to suppress their identities, fight their deepest anxieties, and conform to the names the church grants them in order to be cleansed. Our character wants to escape this, but since they grew up in the church, the only way they know how is to fight the pain and shame they've been indoctrinated to feel. The actions you and other characters take just to make it through this corrupted world are what drive the game's narrative. The game does two very unique things to reinforce this. One is the corruption meter, a sort of countdown timer that increases over time and increases even more every time you die. When it reaches 100%, the course of the story is dramatically shifted, and more or less prompts you to start the game over again. This might sound obscenely brutal, but the game is short enough and the meter increases so slowly that most players probably won't be anywhere near 100% by the end of the game. Unless you're me on my first playthrough, where I reached the final boss at 98% and almost had my heart explode. It's mostly there is narrative flavoring, forcing you to feel how our character can only put up with so much trauma for so long. Second is the game's art style. I can understand why someone would be put off by it, especially if you have epilepsy and are not particularly fond of having seizures. Still, it absolutely fits what this game is trying to do, and can be taken in a variety of ways. It expresses how the influence of the church has corrupted this world so profoundly that even the sun no longer shines. Its levels change their layouts and wrap around on themselves in a sort of dream logic. Areas resemble mundane places, but are distorted just enough to blend the barrier between reality and nightmare. Meanwhile, all of our characters are just trying to make their way through it all, seeking to be saved and be themselves, without really understanding how. The frenetic, scrawling art style can also be seen as a reminder that all of our characters are just kids. The game is like this because the characters' anxieties and nightmares are deeply manifested in the world around them. It doesn't give you any neat, convenient answers, but its visual design is so strong that it doesn't need to. You don't need to know exactly why these characters are the way they are, because you can feel it everywhere. It just resonates that well. And if you're really into the game's story, you can play New Game Plus, which adds tons of more narrative to the game, with the caveat that, well... good luck. I think Lucah is an excellent example of how you can make a game that is simultaneously subtle, while also making the storytelling unavoidable and deeply integrated into the gameplay. All of these games do that to some extent, and seeing them adapt Souls-like elements in ways that surpass the Souls series is really fascinating. It's honestly silly that we even have to categorize these games by their similarity to the Souls series, because by innovating on these original ideas, they really come into their own. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in conclusion, kill your genres. The Second Dimension has proven an excellent ground for innovating on unique ideas and mechanics that Dark Souls popularized. It's a little ironic that, of the games discussed here, the most innovative ones are those that stray furthest from Dark Souls' design philosophy. Like, as much as I love Hollow Knight, things like corpse running just have no place in a game like this. Because it turns out the best way to improve on what Dark Souls did is to not make a Souls game. It's best to make a great, different game that integrates Souls-like ideas if the game calls for it. And if you want to see more innovative games like this, then both creators and fans need to see the genre conventions not as strict rules, but as something to be warped. Something to be chewed up, wrapped in, forgotten, transfigured into something new. This is what makes interesting games. It's also what my dog does to her favorite bed. So to anyone watching, especially fans of the Souls series, if you haven't checked out any of these games before, I highly encourage you to do so. Especially Lucah, that game deserves way more attention than it currently has. That's the whole point of the video, really. I tricked all you Souls fans into watching a video to get you to play some weird indie games, and I regret nothing. And since everyone who thinks my opinions are bad have already clicked off, Dark Souls 3 is the worst in the series, and Fume Knight is a better fight than Artorias. Alright, I'm gonna head out.